this is my first time trying to articulate this in a cohesive way. So thank you for being my audience for this. I'm Teaching and Learning in a Quantum Reality is the title of my presentation. And I came to this because I was interviewed not long ago, and as I was going through the interviewer's questions, it occurred to me that of course I have to try to articulate what it is that I do. And as I was sitting with, well, how can I put words to this thing, which you'll see in a moment it can be hard to put words to something that feels new, right? Because when you're talking about something new, we don't yet have a good language that can easily map to this new thing that you're trying to describe. But I realized that what I'm doing is I am bringing forward an understanding about the nature of teaching and learning that is in alignment with the quantum nature of things, the quantum nature of our existence, as opposed to this this Newtonian or mechanistic old view of parts in a machine and of separation of something called an objective separate observer, for example. So that's what I'll be talking about. Let me begin here. Let's see. So I'm going to begin with two images. The first image is from the movie Contact. I don't know if anybody, how many of you are familiar with this movie? So it's from 1997, and a couple of you. There's a particular scene in this movie that, as a metaphor, it has always stayed with me, and that's actually what you're seeing here in this picture. This is a picture of Jodie Foster. The movie is the aliens have transmitted the plans for building this spaceship, you could say, and we built it. So we built it, and Jodie Foster's character is going to take a ride on this spaceship. The engineers noticed that there was no chair, like no device to sort of secure her inside the machine. And so they built this chair, this safety chair, and they've built this chair, and they bolted this chair to this machine, this vessel. And well, let me show you the scene. Let's see if we can see the scene. I have a little clip of it here. All right. So interesting, the technology. If it doesn't work, I'll just describe it to you. Okay, I'll just talk a little bit before I press play, and we'll just see a few seconds of it. So in this scene, she's in this spaceship, and it has been launched, which in this case, launch means being dropped. She's being dropped in this spaceship inside this sort of sphere, this globe. And when it begins, she actually begins experiencing herself traveling through space. And so, and then it'll get to a point, which I'll sort of skip to, when all of a sudden this travel starts to become interrupted with this really sort of scary turbulence and very loud shaking. So here's the beginning of the scene. Oh, that's not it. Try again, come back. No. Okay.
Initiate drop sequence. 5 mark. 10, 9,
I'm going to skip ahead. So she's traveling through. We'll pause it here. So one of the things that's interesting about this moment, I'm going to go back. One of the things that's interesting about this moment is she's traveling through, and you'll see if you listen, if you were to watch the whole scene, she says, "Oh, I've gone through a wormhole, and now I'm seeing this star." She's able to identify things that she knows. So there's a kind of familiar, like, even though this is a shocking experience, there's also like, oh, I can name these things here, this experience I'm having. But then we get to this end of the scene, which is where I'm going to skip to right now, if things work out. Let's see. Here we go. We'll just watch it here. I don't know if you can hear this, but it's very loud. It becomes very loud at this point. Okay. And so this moment, this is the moment. So this structure that had been created out of a sense of safety, is what the engineers said. We saw that this safety mechanism wasn't put in place, so we're going to build it in there. We're going to bolt it to the machine. And then when when she's about to actually arrive at the place, what happens next is she arrives at the place where this machine takes her to. Just when she gets to the place where she's about to arrive, the same structure starts to shake and make this really loud noise. And it's very scary. When you watch it on the big screen, you're like, oh, this is something scary is about to happen. And then you recognize, oh, the scary thing was actually this structure that was created because it was believed to be the thing that was going to create safety. Mm-hmm. And then there's that moment when it breaks free, and all of a sudden you enter into this space. It's just, you're in a space of silence. There's a sense of peace that suddenly comes in, but it's this moment of the unknown. So there's this great space where it's completely dark. We don't know what's going to happen next. And at that moment, she's actually shifted away from the sort of journey, which she thought she could recognize parts on the journey, to this completely unknown space. And I love that metaphor, because I really feel that that's where we're at right now. We were looking to be able to drop systems and structures that have been created out of fear, or maybe created for other purposes, created as a means of extracting wealth, for example, or as a means of maintaining systems of oppression. So structures and systems that have been created out of fear are themselves the source of fear and limitation. What happens if we allow ourselves to drop those systems altogether? What's possible? What's on the other side? And I think the consideration of something on the other side is limited by the fact, if we believe that what we're here to do is keep repeating the structures. Everybody here is in that alternative world, in that systems of alternative education. And so we've already said, okay, those systems and structures do not work. They clearly haven't been working for our students. Let's establish something new. So we're already building something new in our work. But we also know that many, many other people are still dedicated to those systems because they're afraid that if they do something else, they're not going to be successful. They're not going to do whatever. There's this whole line of things that we're said that we're supposed to do to have our success in the world. But what happens if we drop those systems? And what's possible on the other side? So this is the first sort of metaphor, image, concept I want you to think about. And here's the other one. So here's our home. As you know, we have only one star in our solar system, the sun. And from our planet, this is an interesting number if you research it. There's actually from this Earth, when we look up into the sky, there are fewer than 10,000 visible stars, which is kind of crazy because it seems like, you know, all the stars in the sky seems like it should be some vastly large number, but it's fewer than 10,000 visible stars. But in the entire Milky Way galaxy, there are 400 billion stars. Okay, it's obviously a big number. But here's another number. There are an estimated, in fact, this is a pretty, if you do this research, it's a sort of standard statistics that they'll tell you that there are 37.2 trillion, that's 12 zeros, 37.2 trillion, a billion is 9 zeros, a trillion is 12 zeros, 37.2 trillion cells in the human body. But then there are another, this is a kind of estimate because they can't really measure this number very well, but they estimate there are at least another 39 billion cells that are not human cells, they're bacterial cells in your gut that are part of our healthy human ecosystem. So altogether, there are estimated to be 75 trillion cells in the body. So 400 billion stars in our galaxy, 75 trillion cells in our entire body, which is really incomprehensible. Let's see if I can get this next slide. Open up. And so what I want you to sit with for a moment is that if cells were stars, you actually have 185 Milky Way galaxies worth of cells, worth of cells in your body. 185 Milky Way galaxies. That means that number of communications that needs to happen in order for you just to wake up in the morning. The incalculable amount of intelligence and sensing and I mean, it's really beyond, truly is beyond our comprehension if we were just to try to make sense of it with the mind. But we can certainly drop into just the awe of what that means for us to be this incredibly complex being with all of this information being exchanged all the time just to keep us alive and breathing. And then those of us on the call and those of us in our towns and those of us in the plant. I mean, there's just so much intelligence, so much information flowing in our human bodies. And that's, of course, just the beginning of looking at the vast complexity of life that we have on this planet. And so my work has really been about this question of how do we make sense of what's really possible? Because knowledge clearly and knowing is clearly not just something that happens in our brains or in our heads. It happens throughout our entire body, because this vast dance of 75 trillion cells is not happening because I thought about it with my brain up here. It's happening because there's an intelligence and a capacity that my being just has in my humanness. And so my work has been what I call it expanded knowing, because I'm wanting to bring us all to that awareness that we have to expand beyond this concept that knowledge and information thinking, all that's good is generated by what's happening in our brains, when actually we have this whole body being that's both our physical body but also extends out into the world beyond our body. But because of our interconnectedness, we are really truly one. We are truly one being. And so if that's actually literally true, if we are literally truly inside of a vast interconnected web, then how can I use those webs of connection as a means of sensing and gaining information about the world that it seems to be outside of me? So if you and I are connected, then I must be able to know something about you without just what's possible to my brain. That's really the inquiry, the hypothesis, the question. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about how I came to be here. I am a long-time educator, facilitator. Oh, someone's popping in here. Let me just see if I can let them in and then keep going. Okay. I first started facilitating groups when I was an undergraduate. So that was in 1991, and I was facilitating intergroup dialogue. I loved that work so much. And then I started teaching in the classroom in New York City as a high school teacher, public high school teacher in New York City. Also loved that work very much. 2001 is when I started doing that work. And as my career evolved, I was very interested in three things: mindfulness practices, systems thinking, and what was the third thing? Systems thinking. Maybe that's all I need. That's so funny. I thought I had a third. There's probably a third. I'll come up with the third later. But certainly these two things, mindfulness practices and systems thinking. And because life is like that, I found my way to this thing called systemic constellations. And I'll tell you a story about that in just a minute, but the way I would describe what a facilitator of systemic constellations. So I found that work in 2011, 2012. So there's been these decade blocks of time. So 91 to 2001, I was facilitating in a kind of just conversations and dialogues. By 2001, I started teaching, in high school teaching. And then in 2011, another 10 years later, I found this process. The systemic constellations, a systemic constellations facilitator does is they have this amazing capacity to be systems thinkers and systems sensors, sensing with their body. So if you tell a facilitator that you want to work on a question or an issue, the facilitator will take in your question and they will start to have a sense and an image of what the map of that systems looks like. So that's the systems thinking part on the left. And then if you are in a group process, for example, people will actually start standing in those nodes in the system and representing the different parts of the system. And so the picture on the right is an example from a constellation that I facilitated in 2016, where people are representing different points in the system. So in some ways, it's actually very simple. We're taking our understanding of a question, we're sort of looking at it not as a point or as a line, but as a system. And then we're asking ourselves, we're sort of bringing ourselves right inside the system and feeling, what does the information flowing through this node in the system feel like? So I'll tell you about my very first time. This is my first time, not my first time with constellation work, but my first time in a group workshop when I really had a really clear sense of what's possible. Let's see, I'll tell a little story. Hopefully I'll be clear. So 2012, and I had heard about this process. I'd already been doing some personal work around it. I was very curious about what this thing is called constellation work or family constellations. And I show up at this workshop, and in this workshop, you can imagine that there's a circle of people. And the facilitator of this particular workshop, he's a therapist, and he trains people in constellation work. And he would leave a chair next to him. Actually, it's Ed, one of my friends knows. One of the persons on the call knows Ed. So this is Ed Lynch, who is a facilitator. Ed brings up a client who has a question. And the client sits down next to him, and the client says, okay, here's my issue. I have this mentor that I'm working with, and we have a very strange relationship. Things are always going really well when I approach him and when we start to work together, but every time I turn to leave, we get into some kind of conflict, and I can't figure out why this is happening. because we really need to be able to work together. And he says, I love this person. I love him like a father. He's really important to me. So I want to be able to solve this issue, resolve this issue. And so the facilitator, doing that sort of systems thinking thing that he does, he says, okay, choose a person to represent you and a person to represent your mentor. And so you can imagine these two people standing up in the room. They're sitting sort of in the center of the circle that we've created. And they both report, when the facilitator just asks them, what are you noticing? What are you feeling? They both say, oh, I feel unstable. I feel kind of shaky. And so the facilitator turns to the client and he says, okay, choose a second person to represent you and a second person to represent your mentor. And so for, mysterious reasons, he chose me to represent the second him, the second client. So now there are four of us, and I'm standing there representing the client, and in front of me is another person representing the mentor, right? I stand up, and I have this sensation that I have never had before. I immediately feel, I start shivering, and I feel like my body, almost like there's a magnet that's coming, and I'm being drawn to the ground. And I tell the facilitator, I feel like I need to lie down. And he says, go ahead, follow your movement. So I'm lying down now, flat on the floor. And again, it feels as if the whole front surface of my body has been charged and is being pulled into the floor. And the facilitator turns to the client and he points at me on the ground and he says, who is that? And the client says, I think that's my sister. My sister died when we were both children. And my family, in their grief, packed up the house, moved away, and we never spoke of her again. And the moment he started speaking, oh, I'm getting emotional, I can feel it. The moment he started speaking of his little sister, immediately I popped up, my whole sort of posture and energy shifted, and I felt like a little girl. And so the constellation continues. So there's a whole movement that I won't describe the whole process. But by the end, I'm standing up, and I'm looking now at the person who was placed in front of me to represent the second mentor. And that person, it was clear that they were representing this little girl's father. And at the very end, the facilitator says to me and to all of us to follow our movement. And my movement was to embrace this stranger, this complete stranger to me. I'd never seen him before. But in that context, I felt so much love for this person who was representing the father of this little girl, and we embraced at the very end. And it was just so moving to me. And it was through that experience, and then many more, and many, many, many more over the years since then, many more, in which this process happens over and over and over again, where we'll stand up or maybe even just close our eyes, we'll represent something, and we'll have this experience that is in alignment with what we're representing. So what is that? If that's possible, what's possible? That's the question that sort of stayed with me when I first had that workshop experience. If this is possible, what's possible? And because of this experience, I had this phrase that came to me early on when I was sort of really processing, what is happening in this process? And I call it Indigenous epistemology for orphans, which is kind of a mouthful. But the meaning of those words to me is that we have, in this, the current paradigm, we've become so separate from our indigenous ways of knowing. Indigenous meaning innate, our innate human ways of knowing. Indigenous meaning the ways of knowing that our ancestors had. Indigenous meaning the ways of knowing that contemporary living Indigenous traditions continue to have. Ways of knowing that are embodied, present, interconnected. You know, the nature of the Indigenous worldview is that we are not separate, that we are interconnected. And that's the reality. The nature of the Indigenous worldview is that there's no separation between, say, science and spirituality, that there's a kind of a sort of seamless space, whereas we, in the kind of dominant Western educational paradigm, we create all of these separations, and we say, okay, this belongs here and this belongs here, and let's never try to mix them. But of course, you and I already know, because we're naturally, as human beings, these things don't fall into separate categories. They're always interconnected. And so, you know, for me, this question of how do I really understand how they're interconnected actually is answered as I start to explore what I'm calling Indigenous epistemology for orphans, or expanded knowing. That when we expand how we know, that when we stop limiting thinking and knowing by something that's happening in the brain, and actually expand it into our full body, into our full being, then actually we can eliminate the divisions between, say, science and something else, you know, science and then the rest of life. Okay. This image, by the way, is an image that I created after, again, it's actually been for me part of the process of this journey. This is a very personal image because it's a picture of New York City and a picture of Puerto Rico. And in my own ancestry, you know, you could say we're New Yorkers. My mother I was born in New York City, but she's Puerto Rican, and and our ancestor, our maternal line is Taino. And so we have this Native American line that we have become like literally separated from through all the ways in which that happens, right? Through colonialism, through through slavery, through systems of oppression and extraction, when land is being seen not as a living entity, but as something, as a resource that humans, especially man, can just take from. And so this image to me represents that Indigenous epistemology for orphans, that waking up to the not knowing that's innate inside of us, and creating that shift between this, you know, between this interconnected, out of this separation and into this space of interconnection. So that's what this image represents to me. Okay, is this the right, am I on the right slide here? Yes. Okay, current system. So now you know this already. The current system of education, the dominant system, it actually is, what's fascinating when you sort of reflect on this, is that the dominant system of education, the nature of everything we teach at least in a classic, in a typical classroom, is entirely about the question of objectification and separation. That we compare, we contrast, we categorize, we label, we differentiate, and we argue. Like that's, you know, to be able to make a good argument is considered to be your advanced thinking skills. And of course, this structure is only really makes sense when we're in a worldview that believes that we are separate. So it makes sense. Like if you believe that we are separate, if you believe that we are parts in a machine, then it kind of, you know, you can kind of make sense of, okay, well, let's learn about all the different parts and what happens if we put these two parts together. But actually, it's so much more complex than that, as you know. And that model, it not only does it not meet the needs, it actually is, it perpetuates the systems themselves. It perpetuates objectification, perpetuates separation, perpetuates systems of oppression. It perpetuates trauma. because built inside this way of teaching, baked into it, is the belief of this separation. And if that's true, it is it's, you know, that's not true. And I think one of the things I teach a lot is that we can actually feel the difference between a true, I mean, this is really, I would say in some ways, this is the heart of a lot of what we're doing in this kind of process, is that you can feel the difference between something that's true and something that's not true. And so if I feel what it feels like to be separate, a belief in the truth of separation, it's a devastating belief. You bring that into my system. But when I feel our interconnection, our interconnectedness, and I feel the emergence that arrives and arises out of interconnectedness. So emergence is a concept in systems thinking where when you bring together all the parts, when you bring together all the interconnected beings, what emerges is something unpredictable. It's something new, a kind of new dimension. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Okay. Let's see if I can get to this next slide. Here we go. So the shift from that Newtonian worldview to a quantum worldview, and it's really captured in there's the classic study of the quantum observer. And I won't be able, if I were to repeat it, I wouldn't be repeating it correctly. But what comes from that is the recognition that the observer is never separate from what she's observing. In fact, the observer influences what she observes. And this was such a surprise. I think, I'm sure somebody knows the experiment. It was that wave particle experiment about light. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. And so and you can see this beautiful image here. When we start to create this shift in understanding, or really realign ourselves with the truth of our interconnectedness, then all of a sudden we can no longer be at the top of the sort of separate top of this pyramid of objects, but we become one in an interconnected web. And there's a sense of, well, first, one of the things is a sense of humility and understanding that we're just actually part of a web. But then it also opens up into a question. Well, if this is true, what's also unique about me? The nature of the kind of something that looks at things as separate and objective, and that you can be labeled. When you are working with that worldview, then all of a sudden you become part of a group. The thing that makes you unique gets erased by your identity in the group. What happens when you create this shift is that all of a sudden your uniqueness becomes what's central and what's valued, and understanding the particular way in which you relate to the world and to the world around you, and the things that you give to the world and that you receive, that becomes central. So subjectivity and your unique subjectivity replaces objectivity, replaces categorization, replaces labeling. Okay, so here's where I sort of lay out how I have come to understand what this means for education. What does this mean for education? What does it mean? What are thoughts? What is learning? What is information? What are fields? What is knowledge? Okay. So this is my favorite part. Thoughts, thinking, sense perception. Oh, well, then, yeah, here we go. So we have two images here. The Rodin's The Thinker and a beautiful rose. You know, the view of Descartes, which the whole phrase I won't get right, but it's I think, therefore I am. That's how you know it. You know, when I was reflecting on what does that mean? I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. And one of the things I thought about was that that phrase, I think, I generate my own thoughts, therefore I am the creator of the world. I am the center. I generate my own thoughts, therefore I am at the center of all the things. And that now we could have a whole other conversation about whether that's true or not, but I specifically want to take it to that pyramid that you saw, the ego-centered pyramid, in which we place ourselves as an object on top of of all those things. So for example, if I am a teacher and I say, you know, think about a rose. We have a rose here. Think about a rose. Tell me about a rose. What do you know about rose? What's a rose? Right? And we can start to come up with that list. Here's our categories. Here's all we know about roses. It looks like this. It's a flower and it has this smell and it has, you know, and we might, if we're really knowledgeable about roses, maybe we have all the right scientific names and the family and the genus and the species and etc. Or maybe we have some scientific understanding of the molecules that create the smell, okay? So we might have information, we might have knowledge that we can sort of lay out there. But if I ask you to think about a rose, imagine a class of young people, and we ask them to think about a rose. And there's all sorts of information that might come forward. They might have memories of the last time they received a rose, or they gave a rose, or they smelled a rose. Or they might focus on something. Maybe there's a game that they played that involves roses, a video game, or maybe they saw an image. They have all of this information. And so what I experienced through this work is that thoughts, if we think of thoughts as a kind of river, constantly arising, as you know, if you've ever tried to meditate, your thoughts are coming all the time, right? So if I say, think about roses, all of a sudden I'm directing my intention to be open to the thoughts that flow by that are specifically about roses. I'm sort of directing my thoughts, the flow of the river, to offer me up roses, 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 whatever that looks like. It's very similar to if I'm walking by a rose and then I decide to actually stop and smell the rose. I've set an intention and all of a sudden now I can smell it. I might even, if I'm walking by, even at a distance, and I decide I really want to smell a rose, we can set our intention, and even if that rose smell is already in the air, we might not have noticed it until we set our intention to smell the rose. And all of a sudden, we start to be able to pick up on that fragrance. So what I experience as happening is that thoughts, I'm going to show you the next slide, that thoughts are actually a kind of sense perception. See if I can get this. Okay. Thoughts are a sense perception. So if smell is a perception of things in the, what is that? Olfactory, that field of information, and sound is a sense perception of things in an auditory field. Thoughts, the way we typically think of thoughts are perceptions in a non-material field of information. So thoughts, if we're not really being very specific, we might have anything pop into our mind, right? If we're not setting specific intentions to actively think about something. And if I bring my awareness to them, that I'm bringing my awareness of my thinking as a sense perception to the specific thoughts that arise. And when I choose to actively think of something, I'm setting an intention, but I'm not generating the thoughts. The thoughts are arising in alignment with my intention. And thoughts will then come in all forms, not just words in your head, but as felt sense, as, you know, as images, as something in your mind. Like, you'll get all sorts of information when you set an intention to receive. Now, it turns out this is not my idea. This is actually an ancient idea. There's some, I spent many years in a Buddhist practice, and we actually use sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, thought are considered to be the 6 forms of perception, of sense perception. So it was already understood in sort of ancient traditions, spiritual traditions, that thoughts are indeed not something special that you generate on your own, but actually a sense perception of a field of information. We can talk more about that in a bit. Okay. So here, I'm just going to sort of keep going through all my things, and then we can open up the discussion. So what is learning? Now, I had this picture. The first picture here is the picture from that the story I told about the first time I experienced a constellation in a group. And in that experience, so I learned something, and I learned it because I merged with that information. I was literally one. That information was literally inside of my body. And I share this because all learning is ultimately merging with that information. We become one with the information that we learn. And I think it's useful to recognize this, because if what we're doing as educators is to support people to learn things, then that means that we can think differently about what happens in a classroom. We can think about structuring learning so that way it allows people to actually find ways to have a direct contact with the information, direct kind of merging. You know, I have a picture of these mathematical, you know, sort of images and equations, symbols, because any good mathematician truly, or physicists, for them, the language of mathematics is second nature. They have truly merged with that information. So at every level, learning is merging. Anytime you know, I don't think anybody on this call is giving people worksheets, but of course we know that in a traditional classroom, there's lots of worksheets going around, and lots of kids who feel like right now, in fact, are being sent home during this time when schools are closed, and trying to like work on pieces of paper to categorize and label things. That's not learning, of course. If you really want to know something, you go out and have a relationship with it. That's learning. Okay, what is information? Oh yeah, what is information? What is information and what are fields? So these two things are connected, fields and information. So I have a picture of Harry Potter because as a kind of thought experiment, I want you to imagine that every Harry Potter book has suddenly disappeared from the universe, from the planet. If all the Harry Potter books disappear from the planet, where does Harry Potter go? Well, I would say he still exists, because the Harry Potter and the information contained in that story exists as a field. They exist as a specific collection of information that arises around this story world. It doesn't exist because it's in a book. It exists because the story world exists. The story world is real. It's a part of it. It's a field of information. So I have the other picture here is a mycelial mycelium. So as you've probably been, maybe you use this metaphor as well, but there's this recognition that underneath the soil, between all the trees and all the other organisms, there's this rich mat of this fungus, that this interconnected web that is receiving and transmitting information. Information is food. Information is, other molecules, other things that need to be shared between the forest and the forest ecosystem. Information about insects, where they are attacking, or information about other changes in the environment. So there's this system of information that's being shared in a field, a collective, sort of vast interconnected web of the flow of information. So I'm going to go to the next one. So I would say that fields are specific interconnected flows of energy. So there's the field that arises around the world of Harry Potter. There's a field of information in a forest. There's a field that's specific to me when I'm talking about my family system. And there's a field that's specific to me when I'm talking about some other aspect of my life. I don't know, my work in the world. Like, those are very specific kinds of fields. For me, for example, or for you, I might be able to access fields that have to do with your gender and your nationality, just as I can also access fields that are specific about, your parents and ancestors. Those are interconnecting fields that all move through you. You do not need to have, and this is the thing that we recognize, we discover in constellation work, you do not need to have a book that describes that field of information in order for you to access that field of information. We just need to have an entry point to access that field of information. Okay, I show this one to, I talk about this with my children sometimes, when they're, sometimes, they feel, so we're an unschooling family. So the kids are really self-directed, and they have the specific things that they're very interested in. And then they have things that they're not so interested in, that they decided, I don't really want to study. But every now and then they think, oh, what if I don't know enough? What if I don't have enough knowledge? And they're worried about that. And so one of the things we've been reflecting on is of course, we know that knowledge is what we learn, the stuff I've learned, right? But knowledge might be as limited as a grayscale palette, or as varied as this lovely rainbow palette over here. But what's much more important than the knowledge that I have is what I can do with that knowledge. So even if I decide I only know these things, but I have learned to work with these things in this really rich and interesting way. Or I have all of these things, but I don't really do much with them. I still don't quite know what to do with all that I know. It doesn't mean it's not valuable to gain a lot of knowledge, but it just, it's really, it may or may not be, But what's really important for us as educators to be thinking about, especially when we're facing an educational system that the current system, the dominant system, believes that having a lot of knowledge is what's valuable. But of course, having all that knowledge is not at all what's valuable. It's what a person knows, what they can do with that knowledge. So I think this is the close. This is my last, I'm going to open it up from here to questions, and maybe we can play a bit. So it's 3 o'clock, good, well, it's been an hour. So thoughts are sense perceptions that are received from all parts of the body mind, which is why if you participate in a family constellation or a systemic constellation, if you stand in and represent a point in the system, the father, the daughter, for example, in the system, you will receive information throughout your whole body as a felt sense, as a song, as an image in your head, however you will get that information, as thoughts that show up in your head that are consistent with that representation. And learning to trust that that's what's happening is part of the sort of this next movement for us. Learning to trust that I'm not here just to regurgitate something I've read in a book, and that constitutes learning. But what happens instead if I open myself up into a kind of state of unknowing, of not knowing, and just receive information? When I do that, I'm actually instantly merging with that information. So it's that I'm learning happens in this way, at least instantly. I'm not suggesting all learning can happen this way, but this process of merging with information that's flowing through your body. The next question I have here is, what happens if we acknowledge, center, and value our subjective experience? So much of the dominant systems are really about dismissing dismissing the subjective experience. And instead, when we center the subjective experience and ask new questions, all sorts of new questions become available to us. And this is that would be a whole other conversation, but I'm sort of just planting some seeds there. That I can have a subjective experience. So I'll give you a quick example. I did some work. I did some work looking at money. This is a question that many of us have. What is the nature of money? And I had a very specific subjective experience, but I also really feel that my subjective experience is meaningful to us in the collective. So the one piece of information that I experienced was that when money first was, the idea of money first came into our humanness, it was considered to be something that benefits life. So life, the value of money at that time was it benefiting connection and the flow of resources. So it really was a benefit to life. And we actually have, Marianne was on that call. Marianne was representing the earth, and she recognized, yes, this money is valuable because it's benefiting the flow of life, and we're all going to benefit. As that constellation continued, we can see this shift to what we're experiencing now, all the different levels of separation and the way in which money has become distorted and separate from that original concept. So that was a very subjective experience that we all had, but the information is very rich and of value to us in the collective. Okay. And finally, what's possible when we just forget worrying about accruing knowledge and instead operate from a place of curiosity, inspiration, desire to solve problems, and bringing our full body, our full capacity for sensing into this space of inquiry. There's so much more. I mean, really beyond. All it takes is being able to ask questions. If you can ask the question, you can explore new fields of information. You will receive new sources of information. You will go to places you hadn't even known you could go to because we had such a limited view of what's possible. And it begins very, very simply in that image I showed early on. Can I think not as a point and not as a line, but as a system? And then can I bring my body, my full awareness into that system? Can I step into that system? Okay. Oh, someone's just arriving. All right, I'll keep recording for now in case we want to record the questions. I can always edit that out if people don't want that part shown. But I'm going to pause and just drink some water. In fact, I'm going to get some water because my water's out. and then we'll chat a little bit. I'll be right back. Okay. So comments or questions or reflections or anything you have?
I have some something to say. I usually do, right? This was really rich. Thank you, Alison. So I'm really interested with that space of inquiry, because a lot of systems thinking is like you can spend a long time kind of getting to the right question, right? So I'm very aware of you know, you and I'm sure you are too, like the questions you ask is what the field shows you, right? Like, so you could get a completely different field depending on the question you're asking. And language itself objectifies, right? So it's interesting to a certain extent. I don't see like the Newtonian period as wrong. I feel like maybe that was the next like I think I more and more believe that was the next evolutionary step for us, and now there's another step. So just to in terms of like part of that thing that you just presented was a desire to solve problems. That in itself is sort of a paradigm around calling something a problem. And just aware in regenerative design, we often don't call things a problem because often the problem is the hidden potential of a system, right? We see it as a problem, but it's so just quite simply, like often a problem is a resource in the wrong place or in the wrong relationship. And sometimes that relationship is just in our head, in the paradigm that we're coming at to quote unquote solve it. So I just wanted to say those things.
Yes, I agree. As you know, I mean, I actually do a lot of, take a lot of what Marianne has taught me, a lot of things that I use in my work. And there's some really simple structures that I refer to a lot when I'm working with lots of people, but including working with teenagers. I've been using some simple structures that Marianne has taught me. I mean, of course, this is just, you know, there's that concept in education of scaffolding. You know, how do we get from point A to point B, right? And how do we begin to have a language? I said this in the beginning. How do we begin to talk about something that doesn't really have a language? You know, how do I begin to talk to you about that sort of synthesis space when we're still in this the thesis antithesis, when we're still in this dimension? How do I talk to you about this other dimension? So these are all just pointers, but I also think it's important to, you know, we begin, and I think having a problem that we want to solve, I think that's a legitimate. People look around first and they say, oh, this is a problem I want to solve, and then they start down the journey and they realize, oh, wait a minute, maybe it's not a problem. Maybe the problem is a solution, right? That's one of the concepts in the regenerative design, the permaculture concepts. Like the problem, how do I look at the problem differently? But in the sort of classic dominant paradigm of education, we don't even really, like, even how we look at questions becomes very, you know, it's like prescriptive, it's limited, it's very narrow. And so this notion that I can have a question, I can want to solve a problem. Now, how do I think about the problem, right? What's the system in which this problem is embedded? Let's represent those points in the system and step in and feel what it feels like. And, you know, part of what I imagine for me is that I'm not, you know, those of us who do constellation work, and for me as a facilitator, I'm sort of holding a space and guiding a process towards a healing resolution. But part of what I'm interested in what I'm describing here is that I really just want people to understand what's possible, to step in the field, and to learn together how to work with the information that comes, that doesn't necessarily require a wise facilitator to be guiding the process. And so we might begin first with saying, I have a problem. And as we explore the problem, we realize, oh, actually, I don't have a problem. I have a solution that I've been looking at the wrong way. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. As I was hearing you now, how can we keep our children stay in the quantum field? Because I feel that my 3-year-old daughter is there, but me, until I educate myself practically to be all the time there, I feel that I bring her out from there with all the Newtonian and mental structure we have.
Yeah.
Which is the most efficient way that I, as a mother, can use to make her, not make her with a sense of force, but with guiding her to be confident about what she feels or how she reacts in things that she cannot explain, and without me asking her to explain.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you understood what
well,
is the question.
I'll give this answer and you'll see if it fits your question. I'll begin first by describing a picture that I drew. I drew it a few years ago. And it's a picture, I think I described it maybe to you, Lori, but because I feel like I told somebody about it. Anyways, it's a picture of me and my children. I drew the sketch of the three of us in a canoe, a little boat. And my children, their hearts were like the guiding us forward. And in the picture, I drew me with all these chains on my head pulling us back, right? And so I drew that picture because I really knew that in especially as an unschooling parent who I have to do all this deschooling to sort of get rid of all the conditioning that I have in my brain, in my body, that I had to really trust that they are in contact with the flow of life that they're being guided with. And the more I can get out of the way, the better, right? And I think you know that already, right? The more you can get out of the way, the better. However, they will also, as naturally, encounter life and they'll encounter their own versions of those things that get them stuck. And how we respond to those moments, I think, is really useful to start to attend to. If I respond to those moments from my own fear, like if I immediately get caught up in that like future projection, then I'm not serving, I'm not supporting them. So for me, what I've really learned to do, and again, I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, but you give me information. One of the things I've learned to do is really become super present, to practice always, a practice of being present with my children. What are they really saying to me right now? So when I think about my daughter, for example, when she comes to me and she says, I'm feeling this way, I feel really bad, or I feel really stuck, or I feel really, I have a part of me that will immediately project into the future the implications for this. Oh, this means she's going to be whatever, she's never going to learn math, or she's never, you know. And instead, I have to pull it back and listen really close. What is she really saying? She's really saying that she's having this thought that she's not good enough, let's say. And that's the thought is what's causing the problem. Not that she's actually not good enough. Not that she's actually not open to the world. Not that she's actually, you know, and I can be able to see, oh, you're having that thought. That must feel really bad. So I've had to practice becoming super on point, super present with what's actually arising with my children. So that way I can stay out of the way. That ultimately, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to keep my own baggage, my own chains that are around my, that have conditioned me out of the way of their own heart and where that's guiding them. Was that helpful?
Yes, it's helpful, of course. A lot of mental things come, but I will stay to what I heard really inside. Thanks.
Yeah.
I have a few thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
I just wrapping my head around what you just said and how knowing as the adult, somebody who's been through the system, is kind of our thoughts, our mindsets are very conditioned and trained a lot. And so to trust in the children to guide us, and what does that look like for the future of education? I work in a Sudbury school, and one of my biggest questions is, how can I help make sure that within this, Sudbury is like a kind of system in itself. It's not as bad as the public school system and as bad as what we've known, but it's still not as free as unschooling. And we know that in order to move forward, somehow we're going to have a mass population of education, right? And is Sudbury that thing? It possibly could be, but how do we bring such a intimate concept into a larger community? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we could be doing the same action. So I could be a teacher in front of a classroom, right? Two teachers in front of a classroom. Where the teacher is oriented makes all the difference. So in some ways, what I'm saying is that the actions themselves, I mean, the actions are important, but what's driving the action, what's behind the action is more important. And is it more important? So I guess, so I'm saying this because I really want to orient. So I'll give a different example. Right now, we're in this time when there's so much fear, you know, the nature of this time. And in some ways, a lot of people would say, well, it makes sense to be afraid because this terrible thing is happening. So we have to be afraid. And if you actually attend, so if you expand your knowing into your body, so I could say those words, oh, it makes sense to be afraid, you know, because you have to be really cautious so we don't get sick, right? But if I attend to my body and what's coming up, if I look in my body and I realize, oh, look at all this tension, I'm feeling all this tightness here. I actually feel a kind of constriction at my throat. This is what fear feels like to me. Or maybe I feel it in my belly. Like if I can feel that I'm actually operating from fear, then every choice I make from fear will be sort of, if you think of it as like sort of what else gets transmitted in my choices. Fear is also getting transmitted. There's this action I'm taking, but then there's this whole other world of fear that's just sort of being spread out into the world. I can decide I'm going to say wear a mask, or I'm going to do these precautions, but if I can do them from a place of, you know, there's lots of other places I can do that from in my body. I can do it from a place of calm. I can do that from a place of desire to be protect other people from anything I might have. I can move through the world instead of moving through that world with my mask with fear behind me and suspicion. I can still wear that mask, but I can look at the world with openness and, you know, sort of be sending love and warm feelings out to the world. So because we go back to school in the classroom. In my fantasy, there's school and there's classrooms. There's like people coming to school. But what happens in those inside of those classrooms suddenly starts to look very different because we're oriented differently. The first place that education is entirely future. They're all, as you know, if you look at education, worry, fear, projection of some future is embedded everywhere in the system. Every person in the system is operating from that space of fear. And it's an unexamined assumption, beliefs, it's an unexamined foundation of education, of the sort of dominant systems of education. What, I mean, you know, there's a whole process that a person might need to go through, like, why do I have that fear? Is that valid at all? Is there something else that's possible? So the other thing that I would say to respond to that is that I think that's one of the part of the value of this work is that when you learn that teaching, knowing, you can access it in this way that happens through your whole body. And it's so much more exciting, so much more engaging, so much more valuable, and opens up to so much more creativity and innovation. Like that just on its own can be, I hope, enough to start to shift the tide of education, because it really is, it's better in every way, I would say. Yeah.
I would also add that it really starts to empower your students, you know, that, because I teach at the college level, and there's still this kind of, you know, like I come in as the expert, and, you know, that giving of knowledge, right? And if you're not doing that, it's like the college system doesn't value you, which is a problem I've been running into. But, you know, I just realized, like, wait, that's disempowering my students. So I really had to kind of step back and go, what am I doing, and how do I train them in my practice so they, you know, like, so, you know, teaching them more of the stepping into the field and the stuff you're describing. I feel like I leave them really empowered,
Yes.
to like work with each other. So after I go, it's not like they were like, well, that was helpful, but now Marianne's gone, right? It's just like a real shift in the power structure too. And just, you know, what you're sharing, Alison, in your work, it just is, it's just the whole power paradigm in education.
That's exactly right. For me, when that phrase, Indigenous epistemology for orphans, that part of that, what that phrase has meant to me is that it really is a decolonization at that core, like that intellectual, mental decolonization, that I don't look outside of me for knowledge and for the source of information, but actually I can source information from within. That is the most empowering, revolutionary step. The shift in power is the revolution in this work. Yeah, Sue.
Hi. Well, I'd like to spin off from what I love the way you said, let's see, I wrote it down, where the teacher is oriented makes all the difference. And currently I'm working on a book with my co-author, Phil Brzee, who was my mentor for my master's in literacy at the University of Maine. And the book is called Creating Pockets of Freedom, Teaching from the Heart. And so I've been dancing with your concepts and ideas in the philosophy of what's coming forth with this book. And it's stories from 3 teachers, myself included, and we worked in the public system, and we have the range from preschool through college teaching. And it is that very different orientation towards promoting self-agency, that belief that there's wisdom within, and so enhancing our students' intuition, and always with whatever the curriculum is about, personalizing it. What does this mean to you? And then spinning off with what they're excited about, and so forth. And it definitely addresses the power difference, because it's not that we're all experts, you know. And I homeschooled one of my children for his 3rd and part of 4th grade. He was so interested in exploring art, and he took all this time, and he was completely self-directed, and he pulled books down, Chris Van Allsburg, looked at illustrations, learned about shading, did watch shows on art, etc. And it was such a beautiful experience to watch. So it definitely, it's a different paradigm for sure. And it comes with the belief that we all have this inner wisdom. We all have this inner cosmic curriculum we come here to explore. And that education is all about leading from what is within to come without. And that in this whole concept of freedom, and what does freedom really mean? You know, and to be with wearing a mask in these days, freedom to me means that I have a tremendous trust that what's presenting is just what needs to be worked with, and it can be worked with in a completely different way than the fear paradigm. And look what's opening up. And look what's coming up with me, that I can release more to be with the freedom of what I really am, and what everybody else, who I am, who everybody else is. And then that philosophy for sure of understanding the quantum field, that we are all interconnected. So it's very, very important work to share these concepts and this understanding and this paradigm. And it can be done within public systems, because we did it. And we did it often with not only no support from administration, but actually, being, it was contentious. But we just refused to follow it because we knew truth, and we taught the way we taught because it was the only way we could teach from the heart. So I appreciated this. It's very stimulating.
Oh, that's really beautiful. And part of what I hear in the way you're describing the cosmic curriculum is that there's this, and I just love it. I find it so beautiful, that we start with a kind of point. We'll start here, and then it expands into places we could never have predicted.
Yeah.
And that really, the beauty of that expansion into some of these unpredictable and spaces is really, I think that to me I would be thrilled if that's what was happening in every classroom, that we just keep going and keep going and keep going, without feeling this pressure to confine ourselves to some boxes that, to being inside of a box, but also, as you know, the sort of the way in which the system is constantly believes that these limits are valuable. Like, if I can measure these things, that's what's valuable. I just have to keep measuring it. And again, I can understand, but when you're describing that cosmic curriculum and the starting point and this beautiful, mysterious, unpredictable endpoint that's guided from within the child, is just wonderful. So beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, it's 3, here, and where I'm calling from, it's 3:30, just about 3:30. I want to thank you all so much for finding your way here.